Question 1. Performance analysis shows a recurring issue where user accounts provisioned on premises are not appearing in Azure AD, impacting user access to cloud resources. The Azure AD Connect synchronization service is running, but specific user objects are not being replicated. As the Azure security engineer responsible for this environment, what is the most appropriate and secure approach to diagnose and resolve this synchronization problem, ensuring compliance with Microsoft's best practices for identity management? Option A. Manually edit the synchronization rules within the Azure AD Connect configuration to force the inclusion of the missing user attributes, assuming a configuration oversight. Option B. Utilize the Azure AD Connect Synchronization Service Manager to review synchronization rules, filter configurations, and examine connector space objects for the affected users. Cross-reference findings with the Azure AD Connect Health Portal for any reported synchronization errors or performance bottlenecks. Option C. Disable the synchronization of specific user attributes that appear to be causing the issue as a temporary measure to restore service while further investigation occurs. Option D. Immediately deploy a custom script downloaded from an online forum that claims to resolve common Azure AD Connect synchronization failures without extensive prior testing. Correct answer is B. Utilize the Azure AD Connect Synchronization Service Manager to review synchronization rules, filter configurations, and examine connector space objects for the affected users. Cross-reference findings with the Azure AD Connect Health Portal for any reported synchronization errors or performance bottlenecks. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, ensuring secure and compliant identity synchronization between on-premises Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, Azure AD. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for seamless user access and management with the imperative to maintain robust security controls and adhere to Microsoft's recommended practices for Azure AD Connect. Misconfigurations can lead to security vulnerabilities, compliance gaps, and operational disruptions. The requirement to troubleshoot synchronization issues adds a layer of complexity, demanding a systematic and informed approach to diagnose and resolve problems without introducing new risks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging the built-in diagnostic tools provided by Azure AD Connect and following Microsoft's official troubleshooting guides. This aligns with best professional practice because it utilizes vendor-supported methods, ensuring that solutions are tested, reliable, and up-to-date with the latest security recommendations and product updates. Adhering to Microsoft's documentation and tools minimizes the risk of introducing unintended security flaws or compliance violations. This methodical approach also promotes efficient problem resolution, reducing downtime and impact on end users. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, using documented and supported methods demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to maintaining a secure and compliant environment as per Microsoft's guidelines, which are implicitly part of the operational framework for Azure services. Incorrect approaches analysis. Manually editing synchronization rules without a thorough understanding of their impact is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach bypasses the intended configuration mechanisms, increasing the risk of introducing security vulnerabilities such as unintended access grants or data exposure. It also violates the principle of least privilege and can lead to non-compliance with data governance policies. Furthermore, it is not a supported troubleshooting method and can lead to unpredictable behavior and further synchronization errors, making it difficult to audit or revert. Disabling synchronization for specific user attributes without a clear security or compliance justification is also problematic. This can lead to inconsistent identity data across environments, impacting user experience and potentially creating security gaps if critical attributes required for authentication or authorization are missing. From a compliance perspective, it could violate data integrity requirements if not properly documented and approved. Relying solely on third-party scripts or undocumented community solutions without rigorous testing and validation is a professional and ethical risk. While these solutions might appear to offer quick fixes, they often lack the security vetting and support of official Microsoft tools. This can introduce unknown vulnerabilities, compromise the integrity of the synchronization process, and potentially lead to data breaches or compliance failures. It also makes it difficult to demonstrate adherence to security best practices and regulatory requirements during audits. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, evidence-based decision-making framework. When faced with synchronization issues, the first step is to consult official documentation and utilize vendor-provided diagnostic tools. This ensures that troubleshooting is performed within a supported and secure framework. If issues persist, a structured approach involving isolating the problem, testing hypotheses systematically, and documenting all changes is crucial. Prioritize solutions that maintain the integrity and security of the identity synchronization process, adhering to the principle of least privilege and data governance policies. Always consider the potential impact of any change on security posture and compliance requirements before implementation. Question 2. Strategic planning requires a robust approach to securing access to sensitive Azure resources, ensuring that only authorized users can access them under appropriate conditions. Given a hybrid environment with synchronized identities, what is the most effective Azure Active Directory, Azure AD feature to implement granular, context-aware access controls that can dynamically adapt to user location, device health, and real-time risk assessments, while also supporting future auditing requirements? Option A. Configure Azure AD identity protection without additional access control mechanisms. Option B. Utilize Azure AD Privileged Identity Management (PIM) for all access requests. Option C. Implement Azure AD Conditional Access Policies. Option D. Rely solely on Azure AD Role-Based Access Control (RBAC) for resource permissions. Correct answer is C. Implement Azure AD Conditional Access Policies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Azure security engineering, balancing robust identity and access management with operational efficiency and user experience. The organization needs to secure access to sensitive Azure resources while ensuring that legitimate users can perform their duties without undue friction. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate Azure AD feature to enforce conditional access policies that are both effective and manageable, especially in a hybrid environment where on-premises and cloud identities need to be synchronized and secured. The need to comply with potential future regulatory requirements for data access logging and auditing adds another layer of complexity, demanding a proactive approach to security posture management. Correct approach analysis. Implementing Azure AD conditional access policies is the best professional practice in this scenario. This approach directly addresses the requirement for granular access control based on real-time conditions. Conditional access allows security engineers to define policies that grant or deny access to applications and resources based on user identity, location, device health, application, and real-time risk detection. This aligns with the principle of least privilege and defense in depth, ensuring that access is granted only when specific security conditions are met. Furthermore, conditional access policies can be configured to enforce multi-factor authentication (MFA) for high-risk sign-ins, require compliant devices, or limit session duration, all of which are critical for securing sensitive data. The logging and reporting capabilities inherent in conditional access also support auditing and compliance requirements, providing a clear trail of access decisions. Incorrect approaches analysis. Utilizing Azure AD Privileged Identity Management (PIM) alone is insufficient for this scenario. While PIM is excellent for managing, controlling, and monitoring access to important resources, it is primarily designed for just-in-time (JIT) access to privileged roles, not for general conditional access to applications or resources based on dynamic conditions. Does not inherently enforce real-time access controls based on factors like device compliance or user risk during every sign-in attempt. Relying solely on PIM would leave the organization vulnerable to unauthorized access from non-privileged accounts or from compromised accounts that haven't triggered a PIM activation. Implementing Azure AD Identity Protection without conditional access would also be a failure. Identity protection focuses on detecting and responding to identity-based risks, such as leaked credentials or sign-ins from infected devices. While it can flag risky users and sign-ins, it doesn't inherently enforce access controls. Without conditional access, the organization would be alerted to risks, but wouldn't have the mechanism to automatically block or restrict access based on those risks, leaving a gap in proactive security enforcement. Configuring Azure AD Role-Based Access Control (RBAC) without conditional access is a fundamental oversight. RBAC is crucial for assigning permissions to users, groups, and service principals for specific Azure resources. However, RBAC defines what a user can do once they have access. It does not control how or under what conditions they gain that access. Therefore, relying solely on RBAC would mean that once a user is authenticated, they would have access to resources according to their assigned roles, regardless of their location, device security, or the risk associated with their sign-in. This bypasses the need for dynamic, context-aware security measures. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this by first understanding the organization's specific security requirements and risk appetite. This involves identifying sensitive resources, understanding user access patterns, and considering potential threats. The next step is to evaluate the available Azure AD features and their capabilities against these requirements. Conditional access should be considered the primary tool for enforcing dynamic access policies due to its comprehensive nature. When evaluating solutions, professionals should ask, does this solution provide granular control? Can it adapt to changing risk levels? Does it support auditing and compliance? Does it integrate with other security tools? A layered approach combining conditional access with RBAC and potentially PIM for privileged roles is often the most robust strategy. Professionals must also consider the impact on user experience and operational overhead, aiming for a balance between security and usability. Question 3. Analysis of a situation where a senior engineer urgently requests contributor role access to a production Azure subscription to resolve a critical, time-sensitive issue impacting customer services. As the Azure security engineer, you are aware that the contributor role grants broad permissions to manage all Azure resources within the subscription. You also know that the specific task involves only restarting a few virtual machines and reviewing diagnostic logs. What is the most appropriate course of action to balance operational needs with security best practices and regulatory compliance? Option A. Deny the request for the contributor role, stating that only read-only access is permitted for production environments. Option B. Create a custom RBAC role that grants only the permissions necessary to restart virtual machines and read diagnostic logs, and assign this custom role to the senior engineer for the duration of the incident. Option C. Assign the owner role to the senior engineer, as they are a senior member of the team and the issue is critical. Option D. Grant the contributor role to the senior engineer immediately to ensure the critical issue is resolved quickly, and then revoke the role once the issue is fixed. The correct answer is B. Create a custom RBAC role that grants only the permissions necessary to restart virtual machines and read diagnostic logs, and assign this custom role to the senior engineer for the duration of the incident. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma in cloud security engineering, specifically concerning the principle of least privilege within Azure RBAC. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate need for operational efficiency with the long-term security posture and compliance requirements. A senior engineer is requesting elevated permissions that exceed their current role's scope, ostensibly for a critical, time-sensitive task. The security engineer must assess the legitimacy of the request, the potential risks associated with granting broad permissions, and the implications of denying access if the request is valid. This requires careful judgment to avoid both security vulnerabilities and operational disruptions. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the requested permissions against the principle of least privilege in Azure's built-in RBAC roles. Instead of granting a broad, high-privilege role like owner or contributor, the security engineer should investigate if a more granular, custom role can be created, or if a combination of existing, less permissive built-in roles can fulfill the specific requirements of the task. This aligns with best professional practices by minimizing the attack surface and adhering to the principle of least privilege, a fundamental tenet of cloud security and compliance frameworks. For instance, if the task only requires read access to specific resources and the ability to restart virtual machines, a custom role encompassing these specific actions would be far more secure than granting contributor access to the entire subscription. This approach ensures that users only have the permissions necessary to perform their job functions, reducing the risk of accidental or malicious data breaches and unauthorized modifications. Incorrect approaches analysis. Granting the requested broad role without proper vetting is a significant security and ethical failure. It directly violates the principle of least privilege, exposing the Azure environment to undue risk. if the senior engineer's account were compromised, or if they made an error, the broad permissions could lead to widespread damage, data loss, or unauthorized access to sensitive information. This could also lead to noncompliance with internal security policies and potentially external regulatory requirements that mandate strict access controls. Fulfilling the request immediately without any verification, even with good intentions, bypasses critical security controls. This sets a dangerous precedent, encouraging future requests for excessive permissions and eroding the established security framework. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to uphold the security engineer's responsibility to protect the organization's assets. Denying the request outright without understanding the urgency or the specific technical requirements is also professionally unsound. While adhering to security principles is paramount, an overly rigid stance can hinder legitimate business operations and create friction between security and development/operations teams. A security engineer must be a partner in enabling secure operations, not just a gatekeeper. This approach fails to consider the business impact and the potential for finding a secure alternative. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should follow a structured decision-making process. 1. Understand the request. Clearly articulate the specific task the senior engineer needs to perform and the exact resources involved. 2. Assess necessity. Determine if the requested permissions are truly necessary for the task or if alternative, less privileged methods exist. 3. Evaluate existing roles. Review Azure's built-in roles to see if any combination meets the requirements without granting excessive privileges. 4. Consider custom roles. If no suitable built-in role exists, explore the creation of a custom RBAC role that grants only the specific permissions needed. 5. Implement least privilege. Always prioritize granting the minimum permissions required. 6. Document and audit. Ensure all role assignments, especially temporary or elevated ones, are thoroughly documented and regularly audited. 7. Communicate. Maintain open communication with the requesting party to explain the security rationale behind decisions and collaborate on secure solutions. Question 4. The risk matrix shows a critical vulnerability with a high likelihood of exploitation and a high impact on sensitive data. As an Azure security engineer, you are evaluating several remediation approaches. Which approach best balances immediate risk mitigation with long-term security posture and operational considerations? Option A. Schedule a comprehensive system overhaul requiring significant downtime and budget without implementing any interim security measures. Option B. Increase the frequency of security log monitoring and analysis, relying on alerts to detect potential exploitation attempts. Option C. Apply a basic patch to the vulnerable component and consider it resolved, as a full remediation is deemed too complex for the current quarter. Option D. Implement Azure Firewall for network segmentation and traffic filtering. Deploy Azure Policy to enforce secure configurations, and leverage Azure Security Center recommendations for continuous threat detection and response. The correct answer is D. Implement Azure Firewall for network segmentation and traffic filtering, deploy Azure Policy to enforce secure configurations, and leverage Azure Security Center recommendations for continuous threat detection and response. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, balancing security posture with operational efficiency and cost. The risk matrix, standard tool for risk assessment, highlights a critical vulnerability with a high likelihood and high impact. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate remediation strategy from several technically feasible options, each with different implications for implementation effort, ongoing management, and potential disruption. A hasty or poorly considered decision can lead to ineffective security, wasted resources, or even operational downtime, all of which have significant business and compliance ramifications. Correct approach analysis. The most effective approach involves a multifaceted strategy that directly addresses the identified risk with a layered defense. This includes implementing immediate, compensating controls to reduce the likelihood and impact of exploitation, while simultaneously planning for a more permanent, robust solution. This aligns with the principle of defense in depth, a cornerstone of modern cybersecurity. Specifically, leveraging Azure Security Center recommendations for immediate threat detection and response, coupled with the implementation of Azure Firewall for network-level protection and Azure Policy for enforcing secure configurations, provides a comprehensive and compliant solution. This approach is best professional practice because it prioritizes risk reduction, adheres to established security frameworks, and demonstrates due diligence in protecting sensitive data and systems, which is often a requirement under various data protection regulations, e.g., GDPR, HIPAA, if applicable to the specific Azure deployment context, though for this exam, we focus on general Azure best practices and implied compliance with common security standards. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on increased monitoring without implementing any preventative or detective controls. This is a reactive stance that does not adequately mitigate the risk. While monitoring is crucial, it fails to address the root cause of the vulnerability and leaves the system exposed to exploitation. This approach could be considered a failure to exercise due diligence and could violate compliance requirements that mandate proactive risk management. Another incorrect approach is to implement a complex, resource-intensive solution that requires significant downtime and budget without first exploring less disruptive, interim measures. While the long-term solution might be ideal, neglecting immediate risk mitigation can lead to a breach before the permanent fix is in place. This demonstrates poor planning and prioritization, potentially leading to business disruption and financial loss, which can have regulatory implications if service-level agreements or compliance mandates are breached. A third incorrect approach is to dismiss the risk as low priority due to the perceived complexity of remediation. Opting for a minimal, superficial fix, this directly contradicts the risk matrix's assessment and shows a disregard for potential impact. Such an approach is professionally negligent and could lead to severe security incidents, resulting in significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. It fails to uphold the engineer's responsibility to maintain a secure environment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should utilize a structured decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the risk as presented by the risk matrix. This involves assessing the likelihood and impact, and then evaluating potential remediation strategies against criteria such as effectiveness, feasibility, cost, and compliance requirements. The framework should prioritize immediate risk reduction, followed by planning for sustainable, long-term security. This iterative process of assessment, planning, implementation, and review ensures that security measures are both effective and aligned with business objectives and regulatory obligations. Question 5. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a comprehensive identity and access management strategy is crucial for protecting sensitive data and maintaining operational continuity. Considering the need to enhance security posture while minimizing user friction and operational overhead, which of the following approaches best aligns with modern security best practices for an organization leveraging Azure Active Directory? Option A. Implement passwordless authentication methods like FIDO2 security keys and Windows Hello for Business. Enforce multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all access, and utilize Azure Active Directory conditional access policies to dynamically enforce granular access controls based on real-time risk assessments. Option B. Implement Azure Active Directory conditional access policies that block access from any unmanaged devices or locations that are not explicitly whitelisted, regardless of user role or application sensitivity. Option C. Enforce extremely complex password requirements, mandate frequent password rotations, and implement basic account lockout policies to mitigate brute force attacks. Option D. Deploy multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all users and all applications without implementing passwordless options or leveraging conditional access policies for dynamic risk assessment. Correct answer is A. Implement passwordless authentication methods like FIDO2 security keys and Windows Hello for Business. Enforce multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all access, and utilize Azure Active Directory conditional access policies to dynamically enforce granular access controls based on real-time risk assessments. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, balancing robust security with user productivity and operational overhead. The core difficulty lies in selecting the most effective authentication strategy that meets the stringent security requirements of a regulated industry while minimizing disruption and cost. The chosen approach must align with the principles of least privilege and defense in depth, as mandated by general cybersecurity best practices and implied by the need for compliance in a professional setting. The correct approach prioritizes a layered security model that leverages modern authentication capabilities. Implementing passwordless authentication, such as FIDO2 security keys or Windows Hello for Business, significantly reduces the attack surface associated with compromised passwords. Coupling this with a strong multi-factor authentication, MFA policy for all access, especially for privileged roles and sensitive data, provides a critical second layer of defense. Conditional access policies are essential for dynamically assessing risk and enforcing granular access controls based on user, device, location, and application context. This comprehensive strategy not only enhances security posture, but also improves user experience by reducing reliance on traditional passwords, thereby aligning with best practices for modern identity and access management. An incorrect approach might focus solely on password policies, such as enforcing extremely complex password requirements and frequent rotation. While this addresses password-related risks, it often leads to user frustration, password fatigue, and a higher likelihood of users writing down passwords, which is a significant security risk. This approach fails to leverage more advanced and user-friendly authentication methods and does not adequately address the evolving threat landscape. Another incorrect approach could be to implement MFA universally without considering passwordless options or conditional access. While MFA is a crucial component, a blanket implementation without context can lead to excessive prompts for users in low-risk scenarios, impacting productivity. Furthermore, it misses the opportunity to eliminate passwords entirely, which is the ultimate goal for many organizations seeking to achieve a higher level of security and user convenience. A third incorrect approach might be to implement conditional access policies that are overly restrictive, blocking legitimate access for a significant portion of users or devices without a clear risk assessment. This can lead to a breakdown in operational efficiency and user dissatisfaction, potentially prompting users to seek workarounds that bypass security controls. Such an approach fails to strike the necessary balance between security and usability. Professionals should approach this decision by first understanding the organization's risk appetite, regulatory obligations, and user base. A phased implementation, starting with high-risk scenarios and gradually expanding, is often advisable. Continuous monitoring and feedback loops are crucial to refine policies and ensure they remain effective and user-friendly. The decision-making process should involve a thorough assessment of available technologies, their integration capabilities within Azure, and their impact on both security and user experience, always keeping the principle of least privilege and defense in depth at the forefront. Question 6. Research into a mid-sized financial services organization's security posture reveals a growing concern about sophisticated phishing attacks and insider threats targeting sensitive customer data. The organization has recently adopted Microsoft Azure and wants to leverage Azure Sentinel to enhance its threat detection and response capabilities. The security engineering team is tasked with implementing Azure Sentinel, but they have limited experience with the platform and a constrained budget for initial deployment. They need to demonstrate value quickly to justify further investment. Which of the following approaches would best enable the security engineering team to effectively implement Azure Sentinel, meet immediate security needs, and manage resources efficiently? Option A. Prioritize the integration of Azure Active Directory sign-in logs and Azure Activity logs using their respective built-in connectors. Concurrently, develop a few high-fidelity custom analytics rules targeting common phishing indicators and insider threat patterns, and create a focused workbook to visualize alerts from these rules and key sign-in anomalies. Option B. Focus solely on ingesting logs from on-premises security appliances, as these are considered the most critical for detecting external threats. Develop numerous complex KQL queries for these logs without integrating Azure native logs, and create detailed workbooks for each query to monitor specific log entries. Option C. Implement Azure Sentinel by enabling all default analytics rules and data connectors without any customization. Then, create a broad range of generic workbooks that attempt to cover all possible security events, assuming that the default configurations will be sufficient for detecting advanced threats. Option D. Begin by integrating all available Azure Activity logs, Azure AD logs, and logs from on-premises security appliances into Azure Sentinel. Subsequently, create a comprehensive set of custom analytics rules and workbooks to cover every conceivable threat scenario, and then tune them over time. The correct answer is D. Begin by integrating all available Azure Activity logs, Azure AD logs, and logs from on-premises security appliances into Azure Sentinel. Subsequently, Create a comprehensive set of custom analytics rules and workbooks to cover every conceivable threat scenario, and then tune them over time. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, effectively leveraging Azure Sentinel to detect and respond to sophisticated threats while managing a growing volume of security data. The challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive visibility and rapid threat detection with the operational overhead of managing numerous data sources, complex analytics rules, and custom reporting. The engineer must make strategic decisions about data ingestion, rule creation, and visualization to ensure the security posture is robust and actionable without overwhelming the security operations team. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased and strategic implementation of Azure Sentinel. It prioritizes integrating critical data sources that are most likely to yield high-fidelity alerts for common and high-impact threats. This includes leveraging built-in connectors for core Azure services and common security solutions. Developing custom analytics rules and KQL queries is essential to tailor detection to the organization's specific threat landscape and compliance requirements. Creating targeted workbooks for these critical data sources and rules provides immediate visibility into the most important security events. This approach ensures that the initial deployment is focused, effective, and provides immediate value, allowing for iterative expansion based on observed threats and evolving business needs. This aligns with best practices for security operations, emphasizing proactive threat hunting and efficient incident response, and adheres to principles of data minimization and relevance for effective security monitoring. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves attempting to ingest all available data sources simultaneously without a clear strategy. This leads to data overload, increased costs, and a high volume of noisy alerts, making it difficult to identify genuine threats. This approach fails to adhere to principles of efficient resource management and can lead to alert fatigue, a significant ethical and professional failure in security operations as it hinders effective incident response. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on out-of-the-box analytics rules and connectors without customization. While these provide a baseline, they may not adequately address the organization's unique threat vectors or compliance obligations. This passive approach can leave critical vulnerabilities undetected and represents a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting organizational assets. A third incorrect approach is to create numerous complex custom queries and workbooks without a clear understanding of the data sources or the specific threats they are intended to detect. This results in inefficient queries that consume excessive resources and workbooks that are difficult to interpret, hindering effective analysis and response. This demonstrates a lack of foundational understanding and planning, leading to wasted effort and potentially ineffective security controls. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a phased and risk-based approach to Azure Sentinel implementation. This involves 1. Understanding the organization's critical assets and potential threat actors. 2. Prioritizing data source integration based on their relevance to identified risks. 3. Developing and testing custom analytics rules and KQL queries to detect specific threats. 4. Creating targeted workbooks for visualization and reporting on key security metrics. 5. Continuously monitoring, tuning, and refining the Sentinel deployment based on threat intelligence and operational feedback. This iterative process ensures that the security solution remains effective, efficient, and aligned with evolving security needs and regulatory expectations. Question 7. Operational review demonstrates that Azure Security Center is generating a significant volume of security recommendations and alerts across various Azure resources. As the Azure security engineer, you need to establish a process for managing these insights to improve the organization's security posture. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional best practices for configuring and monitoring Azure Security Center? Option A. Immediately address every security recommendation and alert as it appears in Azure Security Center to ensure all potential threats are mitigated without delay. Option B. Configure Azure Security Center to only generate alerts for critical vulnerabilities, disabling alerts for medium and low severity issues to reduce operational noise. Option C. Prioritize remediation efforts based on the severity of security recommendations and alerts, integrating approved changes into the established IT change management process for controlled deployment. Option D. Rely solely on automated remediation capabilities within Azure Security Center for all identified security issues, without manual review or integration into existing workflows. The correct answer is C. Prioritize remediation efforts based on the severity of security recommendations and alerts, integrating approved changes into the established IT change management process for controlled deployment. Explanation: this scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, balancing proactive security posture management with the operational demands of a cloud environment. The core difficulty lies in effectively translating the insights provided by Azure Security Center into actionable security improvements without causing undue disruption or missing critical threats. The regulatory framework for this exam, implicitly US-based for Azure services, emphasizes compliance with industry standards and best practices for data protection and system integrity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and risk-based methodology. By focusing on high-severity recommendations first, the engineer ensures that the most critical vulnerabilities are addressed promptly, aligning with the principle of least privilege and defense in depth. Integrating these findings into the existing change management process is crucial for maintaining operational stability and ensuring that security enhancements are implemented in a controlled and documented manner. This adheres to common security frameworks like NIST, which advocate for continuous monitoring and risk mitigation. An incorrect approach that solely relies on immediate remediation of all alerts without prioritization would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to alert fatigue, unnecessary downtime, and misallocation of resources, potentially violating the ethical obligation to maintain system availability and integrity. Furthermore, ignoring alerts or only addressing them reactively, without a structured process for analysis and remediation, demonstrates a failure to implement a robust security program, which could have regulatory implications if a breach were to occur due to unaddressed threats. Another incorrect approach, such as disabling alerts to reduce noise, is a direct contravention of the security engineer's duty to monitor and protect the environment, creating significant ethical and potential legal liabilities. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that involves continuous assessment of the threat landscape, understanding the business impact of potential vulnerabilities, and leveraging the tools provided by Azure Security Center to prioritize actions. This framework should include regular review of security recommendations, alert triage based on severity and potential impact, and a clear process for implementing changes, including rollback plans. Question 8. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing more stringent access controls for sensitive cloud applications is crucial for data protection. The organization has a diverse workforce accessing these applications from various locations and using both company-managed and personal devices. The security team needs to design an Azure AD conditional access policy that effectively mitigates risks associated with compromised credentials, unauthorized access from untrusted networks, and the use of non-compliant devices, while minimizing disruption to legitimate user workflows. Which of the following conditional access policy designs best balances these requirements? Option A. Require multi-factor authentication for all cloud apps, regardless of user location or device compliance. Option B. Require multi-factor authentication only when users are outside a trusted network location. Option C. Require device compliance for access to all cloud apps, regardless of user location or the need for multi-factor authentication. Option D. Require multi-factor authentication for all cloud apps when users are outside a trusted network location and on non-compliant devices. Correct answer is D. Require multi-factor authentication for all cloud apps when users are outside a trusted network location and on non-compliant devices. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cloud security engineering, balancing robust security with user productivity and operational efficiency. The organization needs to protect sensitive data and resources while ensuring employees can perform their duties effectively. The complexity arises from the need to implement granular access controls that adapt to dynamic conditions, such as device compliance and user location, without creating undue friction or security gaps. The challenge is to design a conditional access policy that is both effective against threats and practical for end users, requiring a deep understanding of Azure AD conditional access capabilities and their implications. Correct approach analysis. Implementing a conditional access policy that requires multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all cloud apps when users are outside a trusted network location and on non-compliant devices represents best professional practice. This approach leverages multiple signals to enforce security. Requiring MFA significantly strengthens authentication, mitigating risks associated with compromised credentials. Restricting access from untrusted locations and enforcing device compliance further reduces the attack surface by ensuring that access is only granted from known, secure environments and devices that meet organizational security standards. This layered security approach aligns with the principle of least privilege and defense in depth, which are fundamental to modern security frameworks and are implicitly supported by regulatory expectations for data protection and access control. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that only requires MFA for all cloud apps, regardless of location or device compliance, is overly restrictive and can lead to significant user friction and productivity loss. While it enhances security, it fails to consider the context of access, potentially hindering legitimate business operations and leading to user workarounds that bypass security controls. This approach lacks the nuanced risk assessment expected in professional security design. Another incorrect approach would be to only enforce device compliance for access to all cloud apps. This overlooks the critical risk of compromised credentials, as a compliant device can still be used by an unauthorized individual if their credentials are stolen. It also doesn't account for the inherent risks associated with accessing sensitive data from untrusted network locations, which can be a vector for man-in-the-middle attacks. Finally, an approach that only requires MFA when users are outside a trusted network location, without considering device compliance, leaves the organization vulnerable. A user's device could be compromised with malware, and if they are accessing from a trusted network, this policy would not trigger additional security measures, potentially allowing sensitive data to be exfiltrated or manipulated from a compromised endpoint. This demonstrates a failure to consider the full threat landscape. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this by first identifying the most critical assets and data requiring protection. Then, they should analyze the typical user access patterns and the associated risks. This involves understanding the capabilities of Azure AD conditional access and how to combine different signals, user, location, device, application to create dynamic and context-aware access policies. The goal is to implement the strongest possible security posture that is still operationally feasible, prioritizing policies that address the highest risks with the least impact on legitimate user activity. This iterative process of assessment, implementation, and monitoring is crucial for effective cloud security management. Question 9. Which approach would be most effective in managing access to sensitive Azure resources for a diverse workforce, including internal employees and external collaborators, while adhering to the principle of least privilege and maintaining administrative efficiency? Option A. Grant broad administrative roles to all member users and limited, time-bound access to guest users for specific collaboration portals only. Option B. Create specific security groups for each resource that requires access, assign roles to these groups, and then add individual member users and guest users to the relevant groups based on their access needs. Option C. Utilize Microsoft 365 groups for all collaboration and resource access, assigning Azure roles to these groups for both member and guest users. Option D. Assign Azure roles directly to individual member users and guest users based on their job function, without the use of intermediate groups. The correct answer is D. Assign Azure roles directly to individual member users and guest users based on their job function, without the use of intermediate groups. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Azure security engineering, balancing the need for efficient access management with robust security controls and compliance requirements. The challenge lies in determining the most secure and manageable method for granting access to sensitive resources, considering the different types of users and groups available within Azure Active Directory, now Microsoft Entra ID. A misstep can lead to over-provisioning of privileges, increased attack surface, and potential non-compliance with internal policies or external regulations. The need for a risk-based approach is paramount, ensuring that access is granted based on the principle of least privilege. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic risk assessment to determine the appropriate user and group configurations. This aligns with best practices for Azure security and compliance. By first identifying the sensitivity of the data and the required access levels, security engineers can then choose the most granular and secure method for granting permissions, utilizing security groups for resource access and assigning roles to these groups, rather than directly to individual users, adheres to the principle of least privilege. This simplifies management, reduces the risk of accidental overpermissioning, and provides a clear audit trail. Guest users should be managed with extreme caution, with their access strictly limited to what is necessary for their specific collaboration needs and regularly reviewed. Microsoft 365 groups, while useful for collaboration, are not the primary mechanism for granular Azure resource role assignments and should be used judiciously in this context to avoid confusion and potential security gaps. Incorrect approaches analysis. Granting direct role assignments to individual member users for all resource access, regardless of the sensitivity or frequency of access, is a failure of the principle of least privilege. This approach leads to a sprawling and difficult-to-manage permission landscape, increasing the risk of unauthorized access if a user account is compromised. It also makes auditing and revoking access more complex. Assigning roles directly to guest users for broad access to sensitive resources is a significant security and compliance failure. Guest users are external to the organization, and their access must be strictly controlled and time-bound. Broad assignments increase the attack surface and the potential for data exfiltration or unauthorized modifications by external parties. Creating numerous individual security groups for each user and assigning roles to these groups for every resource access scenario, while adhering to least privilege in principle, creates an unmanageable administrative overhead. This approach is inefficient and prone to errors, making it difficult to maintain security posture and audit access effectively. The goal is to balance granular control with administrative efficiency. Professional reasoning. When faced with managing user and group access in Azure, a security engineer must adopt a structured, risk-based methodology. This begins with understanding the data and resources to be protected, identifying the users who require access, and determining the minimum necessary privileges for each user or role. The process should involve 1. Classifying data and resources by sensitivity. 2. Identifying user roles and their legitimate access needs. 3. Leveraging Azure AD Microsoft Intra ID security groups to represent collections of users with similar access requirements. 4. Assigning Azure roles to these security groups for granular control over resources. 5. Implementing strict policies and regular reviews for guest user access. 6. Documenting all access assignments and configurations for auditability. This systematic approach ensures security, compliance, and manageability. Question 10. The review process indicates that the organization is experiencing an increase in B2B collaboration with external partners, necessitating a reevaluation of how guest user access and permissions are managed within Azure AD. The current configuration allows external users to access a broad range of internal resources upon invitation, with minimal oversight on their ongoing access needs. What is the most effective approach to enhance security while facilitating necessary collaboration? Option A. Rely solely on multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all external identities, assuming that MFA alone is sufficient to secure their access to internal resources. Option B. Implement a policy that grants external collaborators the minimum necessary permissions required for their specific tasks, coupled with regular access reviews and automated revocation of access upon project completion or inactivity. Option C. Disable all B2B collaboration features in Azure AD to eliminate any potential security risks associated with external identities. Option D. Grant all invited external users full administrative privileges within the Azure AD tenant to ensure they have unrestricted access to all necessary resources for seamless collaboration. The correct answer is B. Implement a policy that grants external collaborators the minimum necessary permissions required for their specific tasks, coupled with regular access reviews and automated revocation of access upon project completion or inactivity. Explanation. The review process indicates a need to strengthen the security posture for external identities collaborating with the organization. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the business need for seamless B2B collaboration with robust security controls to protect sensitive data. Misconfigurations can lead to unauthorized access, data breaches, and compliance violations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a risk-based strategy for managing external identities. By implementing granular access controls based on the principle of least privilege and regularly reviewing guest user access, the organization minimizes its attack surface. This aligns with the general security principles of data protection and access management, which are implicitly expected in any regulated environment, even without specific jurisdictional mandates for B2B identity management. The focus on regular audits and timely revocation of access directly addresses the dynamic nature of collaboration and the potential for dormant or excessive permissions to be exploited. An incorrect approach that involves granting broad administrative privileges to all external collaborators is professionally unacceptable. This violates the principle of least privilege, significantly increasing the risk of accidental or malicious data exposure and unauthorized system modifications. Such a broad grant of access would likely be considered a failure to implement adequate security controls, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny if a breach occurs. Another incorrect approach, which is to disable all B2B collaboration features due to perceived security risks, is also professionally unsound. While it mitigates external identity risks, it severely hinders business operations and partnership opportunities. A security engineer's role is to enable secure collaboration, not to completely block it without exploring mitigation strategies. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of business requirements and an inability to balance security with operational needs. Finally, an incorrect approach that relies solely on multi-factor authentication, MFA, without considering access levels is insufficient. While MFA is a critical security control, it does not inherently limit what a user can access once authenticated. Without proper authorization and access reviews, an authenticated guest user could still access sensitive resources they do not need, leading to potential data leakage. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the business requirements for external collaboration. This should be followed by a thorough risk assessment to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities associated with external identities. Based on this assessment, security controls should be designed and implemented, adhering to the principle of least privilege. Continuous monitoring, regular audits, and a clear process for onboarding and offboarding guest users are essential components of a mature external identity management strategy. Question 11. The analysis reveals that a multinational organization is implementing Azure Sentinel as its primary SIEM solution. They have a complex environment including on-premises infrastructure with legacy firewalls, cloud-based SaaS applications, and a hybrid workforce utilizing various endpoint devices. The security team needs to integrate logs from these diverse sources into Azure Sentinel for comprehensive threat detection and incident response. Which of the following integration strategies best balances security effectiveness, operational efficiency, and adherence to potential data privacy regulations within the context of Azure security best practices? Option A. Prioritize the use of Azure Sentinel's built-in connectors and robust API integrations to ingest logs from on-premises firewalls, SaaS applications, and endpoint detection and response (EDR) solutions, ensuring that data ingestion is configured to include only relevant security events and is secured using appropriate authentication and encryption mechanisms. Option B. Focus solely on ingesting logs from cloud-native Azure services, assuming that on-premises and third-party SaaS application logs are less critical for overall security posture and can be managed separately. Option C. Develop custom scripts to parse and ingest logs from all connected security tools, as this offers maximum flexibility and control over the data being fed into Azure Sentinel, regardless of the complexity or potential for errors. Option D. Ingest all raw log data from every connected system into Azure Sentinel without any pre-filtering or categorization to ensure no potential security event is missed, even if it leads to significant data volume and potential alert fatigue. Correct answer is A. Prioritize the use of Azure Sentinel's built-in connectors and robust API integrations to ingest logs from on-premises firewalls, SaaS applications, and endpoint detection and response (EDR) solutions, ensuring that data ingestion is configured to include only relevant security events and is secured using appropriate authentication and encryption mechanisms. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, effectively integrating disparate security tools into a cohesive SIEM solution, specifically Azure Sentinel. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive visibility and rapid threat detection with the practical constraints of existing infrastructure, data privacy regulations, and the technical complexities of data ingestion and correlation. Ensuring that the integrated system not only meets technical requirements, but also adheres to relevant compliance frameworks is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging Azure Sentinel's native connectors and robust API capabilities to ingest logs from various security tools, including on-premises firewalls and cloud-based endpoint detection and response (EDR) solutions. This strategy aligns with best practices for SIEM implementation by centralizing security data for unified analysis. It adheres to the principle of least privilege by only ingesting necessary data, and by using secure ingestion methods, it upholds data integrity and confidentiality, which are critical for compliance with data protection regulations like GDPR, if applicable to the exam's jurisdiction, though the prompt specifies adherence to the exam's framework, which implies U.S. regulations for this context. This approach ensures that security analysts have a holistic view of the threat landscape, enabling faster incident detection and response, which is a core requirement for effective security operations and regulatory compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on manual log parsing and custom scripting for data ingestion. This is professionally unacceptable because it is time-consuming, error-prone, and difficult to maintain. It creates significant security risks by potentially missing critical events due to parsing errors or incomplete data. Ethically, it fails to provide a reliable security posture, potentially leading to noncompliance with security standards and regulations that mandate timely and accurate threat detection. Another incorrect approach is to ingest all available logs from every connected system without proper filtering or categorization. This is professionally unsound as it leads to data overload, making it difficult to identify genuine threats amidst the noise. This can result in alert fatigue for security analysts and increased operational costs due to excessive storage and processing. From a regulatory perspective, ingesting excessive sensitive data without a clear business need or proper anonymization/pseudonymization can violate data privacy principles and lead to compliance issues. A third incorrect approach is to ignore the data residency and privacy implications of ingesting logs from different geographical locations into a single SIEM. This is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. For instance, if the exam jurisdiction implies U.S. regulation and logs are ingested from regions with stricter data sovereignty laws, it could lead to violations of those laws, resulting in significant fines and reputational damage. A responsible security engineer must ensure that data handling practices comply with all applicable legal and regulatory requirements regarding data location and privacy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach SIEM integration by first understanding the organization's security objectives and regulatory obligations. This involves identifying critical assets, potential threats, and the types of data required for effective monitoring. The next step is to evaluate available SIEM capabilities, such as Azure Sentinel's connectors and APIs, and assess their compatibility with existing security tools. A phased approach to data ingestion, starting with high-priority sources and gradually expanding, is recommended. Continuous monitoring and tuning of the SIEM are essential to ensure its effectiveness and compliance. Professionals must prioritize data security, privacy, and integrity throughout the integration process, always considering the specific legal and regulatory landscape of their operating jurisdiction. Question 12. The efficiency study reveals that the Security Operations Center (SOC) team is spending a significant amount of time responding to alerts that are often false positives. As an Azure security engineer, you are tasked with improving proactive threat detection within Azure Sentinel. You need to develop a strategy to identify potential threats before they trigger automated alerts, focusing on anomalous user and resource behavior. Which of the following approaches would be most effective in achieving this goal? Option A. Rely solely on the automated anomaly detection capabilities within Azure Sentinel without creating any custom KQL queries for threat hunting. Option B. Configure Azure Sentinel to generate alerts for every single security-related event logged across all Azure services, regardless of severity or potential impact. Option C. Develop KQL queries that specifically look for deviations from established baseline behaviors for critical Azure resources and user accounts, such as unusual login times, access to sensitive data stores from unexpected locations, or abnormal data egress patterns. Option D. Increase the number of pre-built threat intelligence feeds integrated into Azure Sentinel to capture a wider range of known malicious indicators. The correct answer is C. Develop KQL queries that specifically look for deviations from established baseline behaviors for critical Azure resources and user accounts, such as unusual login times, access to sensitive data stores from unexpected locations, or abnormal data egress patterns. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a security engineer to move beyond reactive incident response and proactively identify potential threats within a large and complex Azure environment. The sheer volume of data generated by Azure services necessitates efficient and targeted threat hunting. Failure to do so can lead to undetected breaches, data exfiltration, and significant reputational and financial damage. The challenge lies in formulating effective KQL queries that can sift through noise and pinpoint subtle indicators of compromise without generating excessive false positives, all while adhering to the principles of data privacy and security mandated by relevant regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by leveraging Azure Sentinel's advanced capabilities for proactive threat hunting, utilizing KQL to craft specific queries that look for anomalous activity, such as unusual access patterns to sensitive data stores or unexpected outbound network traffic from critical resources, is crucial. This aligns with the principle of defense in depth and the requirement to maintain a robust security posture. By focusing on specific threat vectors and known attack methodologies, the engineer can efficiently identify potential threats before they escalate. This proactive stance is ethically sound as it prioritizes the protection of organizational assets and customer data, fulfilling the duty of care expected of a security professional. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves relying solely on automated alerts generated by Azure Sentinel. While automated alerts are valuable, they are often designed to catch known threats and may miss novel or sophisticated attacks. Over-reliance on them represents a failure to exercise due diligence and proactive investigation, potentially leaving the organization vulnerable to zero-day exploits or advanced persistent threats. Ethically, this could be seen as a dereliction of duty if it leads to a missed breach that could have been prevented with more active hunting. Another incorrect approach is to perform broad, unfocused searches across all Azure logs without a specific hypothesis. This is inefficient and likely to generate a high volume of false positives, consuming valuable time and resources. It demonstrates a lack of strategic thinking in threat hunting and can lead to alert fatigue, where genuine threats are overlooked due to the sheer volume of noise. Professionally, this approach is unsustainable and does not represent a mature security operation. A third incorrect approach is to ignore or dismiss unusual log entries without further investigation, assuming they are benign. This is a critical ethical and professional failure. Any deviation from normal operational patterns, especially in security logs, warrants investigation. Dismissing such entries without proper analysis could mean overlooking early indicators of a compromise, leading to severe consequences for the organization. This directly contravenes the professional obligation to protect the organization's security. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a hypothesis-driven approach to threat hunting. This involves forming educated guesses about potential threats based on threat intelligence, understanding of the organization's environment, and common attack techniques. KQL queries should then be designed to test these hypotheses. Regularly reviewing and refining these queries based on findings and evolving threat landscapes is essential. Furthermore, professionals must maintain a balance between proactive hunting and reactive incident response, ensuring that both aspects of security operations are adequately resourced and executed. This systematic and informed approach ensures efficient use of resources and maximizes the chances of detecting and mitigating threats effectively. Question 13. The performance metrics show a significant increase in detected endpoint threats, prompting the integration of a new endpoint detection and response (EDR) solution with Azure Sentinel. As an Azure security engineer operating under U.S. regulatory frameworks, What is the most critical consideration when configuring the EDR solution to ensure compliance and effective threat analysis? Option A. Focusing solely on the EDR solution's advanced threat hunting capabilities and automated response playbooks without a thorough review of its data retention policies and their adherence to U.S. legal mandates. Option B. Prioritizing the EDR solution's ability to ingest the largest volume of endpoint telemetry data possible to maximize the potential for threat detection, regardless of where that data is processed or stored. Option C. Verifying that the EDR solution's data ingestion and storage configurations align with U.S. data residency requirements and relevant industry-specific regulations, such as HIPAA or PCI DSS, for the types of data being collected. Option D. Implementing the EDR solution with the default global Azure Sentinel workspace settings to streamline the integration process and reduce initial setup time. The correct answer is C. Verifying that the EDR solution's data ingestion and storage configurations align with U.S. data residency requirements and relevant industry-specific regulations, such as HIPAA or PCI DSS, for the types of data being collected. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, balancing the need for rapid threat detection and response with the regulatory requirements for data handling and privacy. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that the integration of an endpoint detection and response EDR solution with Azure Sentinel not only enhances security posture, but also adheres to the specific data residency and processing regulations applicable within the United States, as mandated for this exam. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes compliance with U.S. data privacy laws, such as HIPAA for healthcare data or PCI DSS for payment card information, by ensuring that sensitive endpoint data is processed and stored within approved geographic regions. This proactive compliance measure mitigates legal and financial risks associated with data breaches and unauthorized access, aligning with the ethical obligation to protect sensitive information. Furthermore, it ensures that the EDR solution's capabilities are leveraged effectively within the defined legal boundaries, providing actionable intelligence without compromising regulatory standing. An incorrect approach that fails to consider data residency requirements would be professionally unacceptable. For instance, if an EDR solution is configured to send endpoint logs to a data center outside the United States without proper legal mechanisms or contractual agreements in place, it could violate U.S. data protection laws. This would expose the organization to significant penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. Another failure would be to ignore the specific data retention policies mandated by U.S. regulations, leading to either premature deletion of critical evidence or excessive storage costs and compliance risks. A third failure would be to implement EDR without a clear understanding of how the collected data will be anonymized or pseudonymized, if it needs to be shared or analyzed, in a way that could inadvertently reveal personally identifiable information, thus violating privacy principles. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable U.S. regulatory landscape relevant to the data being collected. This includes identifying data types, their sensitivity, and any specific legal requirements for their storage, processing, and retention. Next, they must evaluate EDR solutions and their integration capabilities with Azure Sentinel, specifically scrutinizing their data handling practices, including data residency options and compliance certifications. A risk assessment should then be conducted to identify potential compliance gaps and security vulnerabilities. Finally, the chosen solution and configuration must be validated against regulatory requirements and organizational policies before deployment, with ongoing monitoring and periodic audits to ensure continued compliance. Question 14. During the evaluation of an Azure Virtual Network's Network Security Group, NSG, configuration for a critical application, you identify several inbound security rules that allow broad access to specific ports. The application team has requested more granular control to minimize the attack surface while ensuring essential services remain accessible. Which of the following approaches best optimizes the NSG configuration for enhanced security and operational efficiency? Option A. Keep all existing inbound security rules as they are, assuming they were configured correctly by the application team, and focus on implementing outbound security rules instead. Option B. Add a new inbound rule with a lower priority number that explicitly denies all traffic to the application subnet, effectively overriding all other inbound rules. Option C. Remove all existing inbound security rules and implement a single, highly permissive inbound rule that allows all traffic to the application subnet, relying on application-level security to manage access. Option D. Review each existing inbound rule. Identify the specific source IP addresses or service tags that require access, and update the rules to be as restrictive as possible by specifying these sources and the exact ports needed, while ensuring that any unnecessary broad access rules are removed or replaced with more specific ones. The correct answer is D. Review each existing inbound rule. Identify the specific source IP addresses or service tags that require access, and update the rules to be as restrictive as possible by specifying these sources and the exact ports needed, while ensuring that any unnecessary broad access rules are removed or replaced with more specific ones. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because misconfigurations in network security groups, NSG, can lead to significant security vulnerabilities, service disruptions, and compliance violations. The Azure security engineer must balance the need for robust security with the operational requirements of the applications hosted within Azure. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the intricate rule evaluation logic of NSGs and applying it effectively to meet specific security objectives while adhering to best practices and potential regulatory requirements. Though for this exam, we focus on Azure's inherent security principles and best practices as the primary jurisdiction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it systematically analyzes the existing NSG rules against the desired security posture and operational needs. This involves understanding the priority, direction, protocol, and port of each rule, as well as the source and destination IP addresses or service tags. By prioritizing the most restrictive rules and ensuring explicit deny rules are used judiciously, the engineer minimizes the attack surface and prevents unauthorized access. This methodical approach ensures that security is not an afterthought, but is integrated into the network design and management lifecycle, aligning with the principle of least privilege. An incorrect approach that involves broadly opening ports without a clear understanding of the necessity or impact is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It directly violates the principle of least privilege, increasing the risk of unauthorized access and data breaches. From a compliance perspective, such an approach would likely fail security audits and could lead to penalties if sensitive data is compromised. Another incorrect approach, such as relying solely on default rules without customization, leaves the environment vulnerable to known threats and fails to meet specific security requirements. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and proactive security management. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining security requirements and understanding the application's communication needs. This should be followed by a thorough review of existing NSG configurations, identifying any deviations from best practices or security policies. When making changes, a phased approach with testing in a non-production environment is crucial. The principle of least privilege should guide all rule creation, and regular audits of NSG rules should be conducted to ensure their continued relevance and effectiveness. Question 15. Market research demonstrates that a growing number of sophisticated cyber threats are targeting user credentials and authentication mechanisms. As an Azure security engineer responsible for a cloud-based enterprise environment, you need to configure Azure AD identity protection to mitigate these risks effectively. Your primary goals are to detect anomalous sign-in behavior and compromised user accounts, and to implement automated remediation actions that balance security with user productivity. Which of the following configurations best aligns with these objectives and the principles of robust identity protection? Option A. Configure a user risk policy that requires multi-factor authentication for all users when a high user risk is detected, and disable all sign-in risk policies to avoid unnecessary user friction. Option B. Configure a sign-in risk policy that requires multi-factor authentication for all users when a high sign-in risk is detected, and configure a user risk policy that forces a password reset for users with a high user risk score. Option C. Configure a sign-in risk policy that blocks all sign-ins originating from IP addresses not associated with the organization's known network ranges, and configure a user risk policy that flags all detected user risks for manual review. Option D. Configure a user risk policy that requires multi-factor authentication for all users when a high user risk is detected, and disable all sign-in risk policies to avoid unnecessary user friction. The correct answer is B. Configure a sign-in risk policy that requires multi-factor authentication for all users when a high sign-in risk is detected, and configure a user risk policy that forces a password reset for users with a high user risk score. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, balancing robust security with operational efficiency when configuring identity protection policies. The core difficulty lies in accurately identifying and mitigating risks without causing undue disruption to legitimate user access. The need to comply with the Microsoft Certified Azure Security Engineer Associate exam's regulatory framework, which implicitly aligns with general cybersecurity best practices and common compliance standards, though not tied to a specific national jurisdiction for this exam, requires a nuanced approach to policy configuration. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it leverages Azure AD Identity Protection's capabilities to proactively detect and respond to both user and sign-in risks. By configuring separate policies for sign-in risks, e.g., impossible travel, unfamiliar locations, and user risks, e.g., leaked credentials, anomalous sign-ins, the engineer can apply tailored remediation actions. For instance, requiring multi-factor authentication, MFA, for high sign-in risk events is a standard and effective control. Similarly, forcing a password reset for users exhibiting high-risk behaviors directly addresses potential account compromise. This layered approach, informed by the principle of least privilege and defense in depth, aligns with general cybersecurity principles that are implicitly tested in the Azure Security Engineer Associate certification. The focus on risk-based remediation ensures that security measures are applied proportionally to the threat, minimizing false positives and user friction. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on blocking all sign-ins from unfamiliar locations would be professionally unacceptable due to its potential for significant operational disruption. This would likely lead to legitimate users being unable to access critical resources, impacting business continuity. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, such an overly broad policy could be seen as failing to implement controls in a proportionate and risk-based manner, potentially violating principles of operational resilience and user experience, which are indirectly considered in professional security engineering. Another incorrect approach, such as only enabling user risk policies without configuring sign-in risk policies, would leave the organization vulnerable to real-time threats that manifest as suspicious sign-in attempts. This creates a gap in the security posture, as immediate threats to authentication are not being addressed. Ethically and professionally, this represents a failure to implement comprehensive security controls, potentially exposing the organization to immediate compromise. Finally, an approach that relies solely on manual review of all detected risks without leveraging automated remediation would be inefficient and unsustainable. While manual review is important for complex cases, failing to automate responses for common, high-confidence risk detections would delay remediation, increasing the window of vulnerability. This lack of proactive and scalable security measures could be considered a failure to meet professional standards of due diligence and risk management. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the organization's risk tolerance, user base, and critical assets. It requires a phased implementation of Azure AD identity protection policies, starting with baseline configurations and gradually refining them based on monitoring and analysis of detected risks. The engineer should prioritize policies that address the most critical threats with the least impact on legitimate users, and continuously iterate on policy settings to optimize security and usability. Question 16. Cost-benefit analysis shows that immediately rebuilding compromised servers will restore critical business functions significantly faster than a full forensic investigation. However, the organization operates under U.S. federal regulations that mandate the preservation of evidence related to security incidents. In this situation, what is the most appropriate course of action for the security engineering team? Option A. Immediately wipe and rebuild all compromised servers to restore services as quickly as possible, assuming that the logs will be sufficient for any necessary post-incident review. Option B. Delay all containment and eradication efforts until a complete, real-time forensic analysis of all compromised systems is finished, regardless of the potential for further damage. Option C. Focus solely on restoring services by bringing up clean systems and connecting them to the network, without attempting to contain the existing threat or preserve data from compromised machines. Option D. Prioritize the preservation of forensic evidence by creating disk images of affected systems before initiating containment and eradication, even if it temporarily delays full service restoration. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the preservation of forensic evidence by creating disk images of affected systems before initiating containment and eradication, even if it temporarily delays full service restoration. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in incident response, balancing the immediate need for containment and eradication with the long-term requirements of regulatory compliance and evidence preservation. The pressure to restore services quickly can lead to actions that inadvertently compromise the integrity of forensic data, making subsequent investigations and legal proceedings more difficult. The professional challenge lies in making informed decisions under duress, adhering to established protocols, and understanding the potential ramifications of each action on both operational continuity and legal defensibility. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes the preservation of forensic evidence while initiating containment measures. This aligns with best practices in incident response, particularly within regulated environments like those governed by U.S. frameworks such as NIST SB 800-61 Revision 2, Computer Security Incident Handling Guide, and potentially industry-specific regulations, e.g., HIPAA for healthcare, PCI DSS for payment card data. These frameworks emphasize a structured incident response lifecycle that includes preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication and recovery, and post-incident activity. Preserving evidence is critical for understanding the attack vector, identifying the scope of the compromise, and supporting any legal or disciplinary actions. Implementing containment strategies that minimize data alteration, e.g., network segmentation, read-only access to affected systems, is paramount. This approach demonstrates a commitment to thoroughness, accountability, and compliance with legal and regulatory obligations, ensuring that the organization can effectively learn from the incident and prevent future occurrences. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately wiping and rebuilding affected systems without proper forensic imaging. This action, while seemingly efficient for restoring services, constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It destroys critical evidence needed for post-incident analysis, root cause determination, and potential legal action. This could lead to violations of data retention policies, discovery obligations in litigation, and failure to meet reporting requirements under regulations like SOX or HIPAA, which mandate the preservation of records and evidence of security controls. Another incorrect approach is to solely focus on restoring services without any attempt to contain the incident or preserve evidence. This demonstrates a severe lack of preparedness and adherence to incident response best practices. It risks the continued spread of the threat, further data exfiltration, and a prolonged period of vulnerability. Ethically, it represents a failure to protect the organization's assets and customer data. From a regulatory standpoint, it could result in significant penalties for failing to implement adequate security measures and respond effectively to a breach, as required by various U.S. federal and state laws. A third incorrect approach is to delay containment and eradication efforts significantly to conduct an exhaustive, real-time forensic analysis on live systems. While forensic integrity is important, an overly prolonged live analysis can allow the threat to propagate, causing more damage and increasing the risk of data loss or corruption. This approach fails to strike a balance between investigation and operational necessity, potentially leading to greater business impact and increased liability. It also deviates from the principle of timely response mandated by many security frameworks and regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with understanding the organization's incident response plan and relevant regulatory requirements. This involves a rapid assessment of the incident's severity and potential impact. The next step is to prioritize actions based on a framework that balances containment, eradication, recovery, and evidence preservation. This often means performing forensic imaging of affected systems before implementing aggressive containment or eradication measures that might alter data. Communication with legal counsel and relevant stakeholders is crucial to ensure all actions are legally sound and compliant. Finally, a thorough post-incident review should be conducted to identify lessons learned and update the incident response plan accordingly. Question 17. Regulatory review indicates that a financial services organization operating within the United States must enhance its threat detection capabilities by integrating external threat intelligence into Azure Sentinel. The organization's security team is considering several methods to achieve this. Which of the following approaches best aligns with best practices for threat intelligence integration and regulatory compliance for a US-based entity? Option A. Ingest a single, unverified open-source threat intelligence feed directly into Azure Sentinel without any prior validation or filtering. Option B. Develop a custom script to parse unstructured text files containing threat intelligence and store them in Azure Blob Storage without direct integration into Sentinel's analytics. Option C. Manually copy and paste indicators of compromise from various public threat intelligence websites directly into Azure Sentinel watchlists. Option D. Utilize Azure Sentinel's built-in connectors for reputable threat intelligence platforms, or ingest STIX formatted data via the Taxi API. The correct answer is D. Utilize Azure Sentinel's built-in connectors for reputable threat intelligence platforms, or ingest STIX formatted data via the Taxi API. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Azure security engineers, effectively integrating external threat intelligence into Azure Sentinel to proactively identify and respond to evolving threats. Professional challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate and compliant method for ingestion, ensuring the intelligence is actionable, and that the integration aligns with security best practices and potential regulatory considerations for data handling and incident response within the specified jurisdiction. The need for timely and accurate threat detection without overwhelming the security operations team with false positives or irrelevant data is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging Azure Sentinel's built-in connectors for common threat intelligence platforms, or using the Taxi API to ingest STIX formatted data. This method is best professional practice because it directly utilizes Azure Sentinel's native capabilities, ensuring seamless integration, efficient parsing of threat indicators, and enabling automated correlation with other security data sources within Sentinel. This facilitates faster detection and response, which is crucial for maintaining a strong security posture and meeting compliance requirements related to timely incident handling. The use of standardized formats like STIX/Taxi also promotes interoperability and reduces the complexity of custom integrations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves manually copying and pasting threat indicators from various public websites into Azure Sentinel's watchlists. This is professionally unacceptable due to its extreme inefficiency, high risk of human error, and lack of automation. It fails to leverage Sentinel's analytical capabilities effectively, leading to delayed threat detection and response, which could violate regulatory requirements for prompt incident management. Furthermore, it bypasses structured data ingestion, making correlation and analysis difficult. Another incorrect approach is to develop a custom script to parse unstructured text files containing threat intelligence and upload them directly to Azure Storage, without any mechanism for Sentinel to ingest or analyze this data. This is professionally flawed because it creates a data silo. The intelligence is not integrated into Sentinel's analytics engine, rendering it useless for proactive threat hunting or automated incident response. This approach neglects the core purpose of threat intelligence integration and fails to provide any tangible security benefit within the SIEM. A third incorrect approach is to solely rely on a single, unverified open-source threat intelligence feed without any validation or filtering, and to ingest it directly into Azure Sentinel without considering its relevance or potential for false positives. This is professionally unsound as it can lead to a high volume of noise and alert fatigue, overwhelming the security team and obscuring genuine threats. It also carries a regulatory risk if the unverified intelligence leads to incorrect or unnecessary action, potentially impacting business operations or customer trust. Best practice dictates a curated and validated approach to threat intelligence. Professional reasoning. When integrating threat intelligence, professionals should prioritize methods that offer automation, standardization, and seamless integration with their SIEM. The decision-making process should involve evaluating the source of the intelligence, its format, and its potential actionability. Leveraging native SIEM connectors or industry-standard protocols like TAXII/STIX should be the primary consideration. Any custom solutions must be robust, well-documented, and designed to feed directly into the SIEM analytical capabilities. Continuous validation and tuning of threat intelligence feeds are essential to maintain effectiveness and minimize false positives, ensuring compliance with incident response timelines and data integrity requirements. Question 18. Quality control measures reveal that an organization's Azure Virtual Network is not adequately protecting sensitive data from unauthorized inbound traffic, potentially violating U.S. federal data protection regulations. The security engineering team needs to implement a robust network security strategy. Which combination of Azure services and configurations best addresses this compliance gap and ensures ongoing adherence to regulatory mandates? Option A. Utilize Azure Security Center's recommendations to identify potential network vulnerabilities and address them on an ad hoc basis as they are flagged. Option B. Deploy Azure Firewall for centralized threat protection and traffic filtering. Configure network security groups, NSG, to enforce granular inbound and outbound traffic rules at the subnet and NIC level, and implement Azure policy to continuously audit and enforce these security configurations against regulatory standards. Option C. Rely solely on host-based firewall configurations within each virtual machine to restrict inbound traffic, assuming this provides sufficient protection for sensitive data. Option D. Deploy a third-party network virtual appliance, NVA, for intrusion prevention and detection, without integrating it with Azure's native logging or policy enforcement mechanisms. The correct answer is B. Deploy Azure Firewall for centralized threat protection and traffic filtering. Configure network security groups, NSG, to enforce granular inbound and outbound traffic rules at the subnet and NIC level, and implement Azure policy to continuously audit and enforce these security configurations against regulatory standards. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cloud security engineering, where a critical network security control, intended to enforce regulatory compliance, is found to be misconfigured. The professional challenge lies in identifying the root cause of the compliance gap and implementing a solution that not only rectifies the immediate issue, but also prevents recurrence, all while adhering to the strict regulatory framework governing Azure services in the United States. The need for rapid remediation without introducing new vulnerabilities or further compliance breaches adds significant pressure. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging Azure's native network security features, specifically network security groups, NSG, and Azure Firewall, in conjunction with Azure policy. NSGs provide granular control over inbound and outbound traffic at the network interface or subnet level, aligning with the principle of least privilege. Azure Firewall offers centralized network traffic filtering and threat intelligence, crucial for meeting compliance mandates like those from NIST or CMMC, which emphasize robust perimeter security and traffic inspection. Azure policy is essential for enforcing regulatory requirements by auditing and remediating non-compliant configurations, by deploying NSGs to restrict traffic to only necessary ports and protocols, configuring Azure Firewall for advanced threat protection and centralized logging, and using Azure policy to continuously monitor and enforce these configurations. The organization ensures that its Azure network infrastructure adheres to the specified U.S. regulatory framework. This integrated approach provides defense in depth, auditability, and automated compliance, representing best professional practice. Incorrect approaches analysis. Implementing a solution solely reliant on host-based firewalls on virtual machines is insufficient. While host-based firewalls offer a layer of security, they lack centralized management and visibility, making it difficult to enforce consistent policies across the entire Azure environment and to meet the auditability requirements of U.S. regulations. This approach also fails to address network-level threats effectively at the perimeter. Relying exclusively on Azure Security Center's recommendations without implementing concrete network security controls is a passive approach. Security Center can identify vulnerabilities, but it does not inherently enforce network traffic restrictions or threat protection. Compliance requires active configuration and enforcement of security measures, not just identification of potential issues. Deploying a third-party network virtual appliance, NVA, without proper integration with Azure's native security services and Azure policy can lead to management overhead and potential gaps in compliance. While NVAs can offer advanced features, their effectiveness is diminished if not managed within the broader Azure security ecosystem, and if their configurations are not continuously audited against regulatory requirements using tools like Azure Policy. This can also lead to challenges in meeting specific U.S. regulatory requirements for logging and reporting if the NVA's logs are not properly integrated. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such scenarios by first understanding the specific U.S. regulatory requirements applicable to their Azure deployment, e.g., NIST SB 800-53, CMMC, HIPAA, PCI DSS. This understanding dictates the necessary security controls. The next step is to assess the current Azure network architecture against these requirements, identifying any gaps. The decision-making process should prioritize native Azure security services that are designed for cloud environments and integrate well with compliance and auditing tools. A defense-in-depth strategy, combining network-level controls, NSG, Azure Firewall with policy enforcement, Azure Policy, is paramount. Continuous monitoring and automated remediation are key to maintaining compliance in a dynamic cloud environment. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows a requirement to grant an Azure function programmatic access to read data from a specific Azure Storage Blob container. The function is deployed within Azure and needs to authenticate securely without manual credential management by developers. The organization operates under strict data protection regulations that mandate secure handling of access credentials and the principle of least privilege. Which of the following approaches best meets these requirements and adheres to best practices for Azure security and regulatory compliance? Option A. Enable a system-assigned managed identity for the Azure function. Then, grant this managed identity read-only permissions to the specific Azure Storage Blob container. Option B. Create a service principal with a certificate. Embed the certificate directly within the Azure Functions code deployment package. Assign the service principal read-only permissions to the specific Azure Storage Blob container. Option C. Create a service principal with a client secret and store the client secret in a text file within the Azure Functions code repository. Assign the service principal read-only permissions to the specific Azure Storage Blob container. Option D. Create a service principal with a client secret and store the client secret directly in the Azure Functions application settings. Assign the service principal contributor role to the entire Azure subscription. The correct answer is D. Create a service principal with a client secret and store the client secret directly in the Azure Functions application settings. Assign the service principal contributor role to the entire Azure subscription. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Azure security engineering. Securely granting programmatic access to Azure resources for an application without compromising security or compliance. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for the application to function with the principle of least privilege and the regulatory requirements for managing access to sensitive data. Over-provisioning permissions or using insecure methods for credential management can lead to significant security vulnerabilities and potential regulatory noncompliance, especially when dealing with data subject to specific data protection laws. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves leveraging Azure Managed Identities. Managed Identities provide an identity for Azure resources to use when connecting to other Azure services. This eliminates the need for developers to manage credentials, like secrets or certificates, within application code or configuration files. Azure automatically manages the identity and its associated credentials, rotating them securely. Assigning a managed identity to the Azure function, and then granting it specific least privilege permissions, e.g., read-only access to a specific Azure Storage Blob container, directly to the target resource adheres to best practices for secure access and aligns with regulatory principles of minimizing exposure of sensitive credentials and limiting access to only what is necessary. This approach is robust, auditable, and reduces the attack surface. Incorrect approach is analysis. Using a service principal with a client secret stored in application configuration is a common but less secure method. The primary regulatory and ethical failure here is the risk of credential leakage. If the application's configuration files are compromised, the client secret is exposed, granting unauthorized access to the Azure resources. This violates the principle of secure credential management mandated by many data protection regulations and security frameworks. Creating a service principal with a certificate and embedding the certificate directly within the Azure Functions code or deployment package presents a similar risk. While certificates are generally more secure than secrets, embedding them directly makes them susceptible to compromise if the code itself is accessed. Furthermore, managing certificate rotation and revocation becomes an operational burden that can lead to security gaps if not handled meticulously, potentially violating compliance requirements for regular security hygiene. Granting the Azure function broad contributor-level permissions to the entire Azure subscription via a service principal is a significant security and regulatory failure. This violates the principle of least privilege, exposing a vast attack surface. If the function's identity is compromised, an attacker would gain extensive control over the subscription, leading to severe data breaches, service disruption, and non-compliance with regulations requiring data segregation and access control. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize managed identities for Azure resources when possible due to their inherent security advantages and reduced management overhead. When managed identities are not feasible, the next best approach is a service principal, but with stringent credential management practices, such as using Azure Key Vault to store secrets or certificates, and assigning only the minimum necessary permissions. The decision-making process should always start with identifying the least privileged access required for the application to function, and then selecting the most secure identity management mechanism available within Azure that supports this requirement, while also considering the auditability and manageability of the solution. Question 20. The investigation demonstrates that a financial services organization operating within the United States has experienced an increase in security incidents related to unauthorized access to sensitive customer data stored in Azure. The security engineering team is tasked with re-evaluating their Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, identity and access management strategy to enhance security and ensure compliance with relevant U.S. regulations, such as those pertaining to financial data protection. Which of the following approaches best addresses these requirements? Option A. Implement conditional access policies that enforce multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all administrative roles and privileged accounts accessing Azure resources. Option B. Disable multi-factor authentication, MFA, for specific high-privilege accounts to streamline their workflow and reduce login friction. Option C. Grant broad administrative access to all IT personnel to facilitate quicker incident response and system maintenance. Option D. Rely solely on network-level security controls, such as IP address restrictions, to secure access to Azure resources for administrative users. The correct answer is A. Implement conditional access policies that enforce multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all administrative roles and privileged accounts accessing Azure resources. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cloud security engineering, balancing robust identity and access management with operational efficiency and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in ensuring that access controls within Azure AD are not only technically sound, but also align with the principles of least privilege and meet the stringent requirements of data protection regulations applicable to the exam's jurisdiction. Misconfigurations can lead to significant security vulnerabilities and compliance breaches, making precise and informed decision-making critical. Correct approach analysis. Implementing conditional access policies that enforce multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all administrative roles and privileged accounts is the best professional practice. This approach directly addresses the principle of least privilege by ensuring that even authorized users accessing sensitive resources must prove their identity through multiple factors, significantly reducing the risk of unauthorized access due to compromised credentials. This aligns with common regulatory frameworks that mandate strong authentication mechanisms for privileged access to sensitive data and systems. Incorrect approaches analysis. Granting broad administrative access to all IT personnel without granular controls is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of least privilege, increasing the attack surface and the likelihood of accidental or malicious data exposure. This approach is non-compliant with regulations that require strict access controls and auditing for sensitive information. Disabling MFA for specific high-privilege accounts to streamline their workflow represents a severe security and regulatory lapse. This creates a direct vulnerability by allowing single-factor authentication for accounts with the highest level of access, making them prime targets for credential stuffing attacks. Such a decision would likely contravene regulations mandating strong authentication for privileged access. Relying solely on network-level security controls, such as IP address restrictions, without enforcing identity-based controls like MFA for administrative access, is insufficient. While network segmentation can be a layer of defense, it does not adequately address the risk of compromised credentials or insider threats. Regulations typically require identity verification as a primary control for accessing sensitive systems and data. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to identity and access management. This involves identifying critical assets and sensitive data, understanding the potential threats, and implementing controls that mitigate those risks effectively. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to regulatory requirements, the principle of least privilege, and the use of strong authentication mechanisms. Regular auditing and review of access policies are essential to maintain a secure and compliant posture.